In the heart of Australia lies a desolate expanse known for its unsettling reputation. This remote region, steeped in eerie tales, has long blurred the lines between reality and the unknown. Are these mysterious encounters mere superstition, or do they hint at something far more enigmatic, hidden in the vastness of the Outback? We have previously dedicated 2 full episodes to tales of high strangeness from highways and byways around the world, in which motorists relate their encounters with mysterious entities, extraterrestrial beings, and various creatures of local folklore. Australia, with its rich and vibrant culture, stands out as a place of peculiar wonders. When European settlers arrived in the late 1700s, they were both fascinated and terrified by the region's bizarre native animals. As they began communicating with the Aboriginal peoples, they learned about even more unsettling creatures lurking within its interior. Locals warned of beasts like the bunyip, a massive seal dog lurking in waterholes, and the yowie, a Bigfoot-like creature up to 12 feet tall, sometimes shy, but often violently aggressive. They also spoke of the Yaramayahu, a red frog-like man that drinks the blood of passers-by, with suckers on its hands and feet. Initially, colonial settlers dismissed these stories as mere fiction, but as towns grew and travel through the outback increased, Europeans began sharing their own strange encounters, suggesting that these legends might hold some truth. But then there are other tales, which venture beyond cryptozoology into the realms of the supernatural and extraterrestrial. Hearing such stories, it's no wonder the Aborigines warned us to steer clear of the Outback. In the late 1990s, a retired police constable going only by the name of Terence reported having an otherworldly encounter whilst patrolling a remote stretch of Outback Highway on his motorcycle. He was a traffic officer, and he had been midway through his shift when he pulled off to the side of the road to clean his visor. This was something he had to do several times a day due to the amount of dust kicked up by the desert winds. After switching off the engine, the veteran officer was suddenly startled by a deep roaring sound coming from somewhere nearby. At first, the noise sounded completely foreign to him. However, after listening for a moment or two, he realised that it was the sound of an engine, revving as if engaged in a high-speed race. Looking down the highway in both directions, Terence could clearly see there were no cars or trucks in the area. Then, as his eyes met the horizon behind a hill to his left, he saw a trail of dust rising from the desert beyond. His curiosity getting the better of him, he walked up the hilly patch of land towards the dust cloud. Upon cresting the small rise, he was met with a very peculiar sight. A black 1953 Chevrolet driving in tight circles at high speeds. At first, he thought he might be witnessing some sort of mechanical failure or medical emergency. Perhaps the car's brakes had failed and its steering had locked. Maybe the driver was slumped over, passed out from a heart attack with his foot still on the accelerator. Reasoning that either of these scenarios could be true, Terence frantically tried to attract the driver's attention. As he did so, he noticed that the car contained not one but two occupants, and that neither seemed interested in heeding his calls. Believing they had not yet seen him, he began to approach the out-of-control vehicle. To his shock, the Chevy then changed course towards him. Before he had chance to react, the car came to a sudden stop about 30 feet in front of him. He could only just make out the shapes of the two figures inside, when simultaneously, both doors opened and bathed the car's occupants in sunlight. Something about this action struck Terence as odd, and he felt a cold chill run down his spine, despite having no obvious reason to feel threatened. This chill turned into a full-on shudder as he got his first look at the driver and passenger. Both were male of the same height and build, with shoulder-length hair and thick black sunglasses. But the similarities didn't end there. The two were, as Terence would later put it, exact copies of one another. Both were wearing the same dishevelled shirt that tucked into a mud-stained pair of jeans, held up at their waistlines by a leather belt. However, they weren't merely the same brand or style, but identical in every way. The mudstains corresponded exactly. The rips and tears in their shirts matched down to the slightest detail. Most unsettling of all was that the two men were moving in unison, walking towards Terence from either side. Step by identical step, the pair gradually started to increase the distance between themselves, effectively flanking the waiting police officer, whom neither of them had even acknowledged. To Terence's relief, they walked right by him and were now side by side again, heading back to the main road. Finding his voice, the officer yelled at the two men to stop as he began to walk after them. Surprisingly, the men began to turn their heads, but as their heads turned, their bodies remained facing the road. Terence could only watch in horror as their necks rotated in perfect unison. 45 degrees, 90 degrees, then 180 degrees, finally completing a full 360-degree rotation to face ahead of them once again. Without a word, they continued to walk over the bluff Terence had traversed minutes earlier. Consumed by fear and confusion, the officer finally summoned the courage to draw his sidearm and follow them, only to mount the incline and find absolutely nothing. No men, no footprints, no dust trail, nothing. It was impossible considering the area. There was no natural cover for miles. Feeling his nerves beginning to fray, Terence turned to look back at the Chevy, only to find that that too had vanished. The shock of what he had just witnessed was so upsetting that he immediately became ill, stumbling back across the empty highway to his motorcycle before pitching forward and vomiting. Sinking to his knees, he covered his face with his hands. Recalling the story years later, he said the next thing he remembers is opening his eyes to find himself kneeling by the roadside in complete darkness. What had felt like only a moment had apparently been hours. The officer hurriedly set off for the nearest town at a complete loss as to what he had just experienced. It was there that he encountered his colleagues, several of whom had been sent out to try and locate him after he had failed to respond to any radio messages. Terence would spend the next few months desperately trawling through police reports and intelligence bulletins, hoping to find some clarification on what had taken place. But he would find nothing, with subsequent internet searches through the years having provided no additional explanation or closure beyond cementing the idea in his mind that the persons he had witnessed were not human, and most likely, not of this world. On the subject of nefarious impersonations, today's video is sponsored by Aura, and it's a really important time to be talking about them because hackers may have stolen the social security numbers of every single American. Over 2.9 billion records were stolen from national public data, which offers personal information to employers, private investigators, staffing agencies, and others doing background checks. These stolen records include a person's full name, address, date of birth, social security number, and phone number, along with alternate names and birth date. And members of the hacker group have reportedly released this information for free online. Whilst I've never had any real sensitive data stolen, I have had my personal email account hacked, and there's nothing worse than knowing someone else has interfered with your personal correspondence. If you weren't taking precautions with your personal information online before, this should be a huge wake-up call. You've never been more vulnerable online than you are now. Aura alerts you if they find your phone number, email, or social security number on the dark web. They're going to let you know fast if anyone tries to use this information to access your credit or bank accounts. They provide up to $5 million in identity theft insurance should the worst case scenario occur. They also provide a bunch of other features to keep you safe online, all inside one app. You can go to my link aura.com/bedtime stories to try 14 days for free. That will be enough time for Aura to find out if any of your personal data is exposed. I highly recommend you do this right now, because not only is national public data not going to do anything to help you, they probably aren't even going to face any repercussions for this leak. Don't leave you and your family vulnerable to data breaches. Go to aura.com/bedtime stories to try 2 weeks for free. Several years after Terence began telling his story, an Australian student named David was being given a lift home by a friend, having finished a term of study at the university they attended. Their route would take them from Victoria's southern coast up to a rural part of New South Wales, a long ride even in the best of conditions. Unfortunately, an unexpected delay meant they would have to travel at night. As the hours progressed, the two friends quickly exhausted all topics of conversation. They were soon travelling in silence along the most desolate stretches of the A79, only passing other vehicles once or twice an hour. They were roughly 2/3 of the way to their destination when David glanced down at his watch to check how much of their journey remained. At that exact moment, his friend stamped on the brakes, causing the car to screech to a sudden halt. The force of this manoeuvre propelled David forward into the dashboard. Upon opening his eyes, he noticed a large crack in the windscreen and assumed that he must have struck his head on it. But when he raised a hand to his forehead, he felt no sign of injury. Realizing he was okay, he turned his attention to the driver and was stunned to see his friend staring straight ahead, eyes wide open in fear, hands gripping tightly around the steering wheel. Clearly, something had struck the car and cracked the windscreen, but despite David's repeated attempts to get answers, the terrified driver remained ominously silent. Deciding to take matters into his own hands, he stepped out of the vehicle and walked around to the front, where he saw some minor impact damage to the bonnet. Still, there was no sign of blood or tracks to indicate what the car had hit. Then, David heard it. A low rustling sound, which gradually began to increase in volume and intensity. Peering out beyond the cone of light produced by the car's headlights, the young student followed the noise until his eyes focused on some movement in a patch of nearby undergrowth. where he was shocked to see a tall, imposing shadow. The towering figure was easily 7 feet tall, with a powerful and muscular profile, yet it seemed trapped in the brush, frantically trying to make its way back to the road. As terrifying a sight as it was, David soon found himself focused entirely on the figure's face, or rather, its lack of one. The creature was hairless, with skin that appeared to be tinged a deep shade of green. There were almost no features, no nose or lips. Instead, there was a ragged hole where the mouth should have been, from which a low moaning sound could be detected. Instead of eyes, it had 2 deep hollow voids, which seemed to tunnel into its skull. But despite having no apparent means of vision, David was acutely aware that the creature was staring directly at him, as it continued to struggle its way out of the scrub. It wasn't until the beast finally freed itself and took one heavy step towards the car that David's paralysis was broken, the blare of the car horn and frantic screams of his friend pulling him from his trance. He had barely closed the door behind him as his friend sped away from the scene. Turning to look behind them, David saw the outline of the giant figure fading into the distance, dimly illuminated by the receding glow of the car's rear lights. The 2 students did not stop again during the rest of their journey, and rather than report the matter to the police, decided instead to quietly get the car repaired at a local garage. During the years that followed, David would find himself scouring the internet for similar stories, and wondering whether some of the accidents that occurred on the remote parts of the A79 were the results of an encounter with this mysterious, faceless creature. As a long-distance haulier, Kyle Weston had spent much of his working life travelling alone across the Outback. During those years, he had seen plenty of things that seemed to defy explanation. Other lorry drivers would share similar stories of the unexplained and bizarre, which served to create a sort of mystique around the region, as well as their profession. Yet as varied as these tales were, the one constant thread was that the drivers who experienced them were careful never to risk their personal safety to find out exactly what they might be witnessing. However, during a 2008 encounter in the Northern Territory, Kyle would go on to break this unwritten rule in a very big way. At the time, he was transporting a large consignment of fertilizer up to Darwin. It was a long haul, and at some point in the trip, he was travelling along the A87 in the middle of the night. It had only been a short while since he passed through the town of Tennant Creek, a sleepy community located near the very centre of the territory, when he found his attention drawn to a patch of land not far from the highway. Despite being firmly in the middle of nowhere, Kyle could see a distinct red glow, which was intense enough to be seen from several miles away. For some reason, he began to slow his vehicle, staring more intently at it. Thinking it might be a fire or distress signal, he made the decision to stop and investigate. Pulling off to the side of the road, he grabbed a torch from the console and set off on foot into the bushland which lay between him and the mysterious light source. After walking for around 5 minutes, he noticed that the trees around him had become gradually denser, whilst the light in the distance had only grown stronger. Suddenly, it disappeared. It was so rapid that Kyle thought someone had flicked a switch or pulled a plug. Now alone in the dark, with nothing but his torch, he began to regret his impulsive decision to investigate. Turning to head back to his truck, the red light suddenly returned. This time it was much closer, bathing him in a blinding glow that forced him to raise a hand to shield his eyes. Peering between his fingers, he noticed a shape moving towards him. It was the outline of a human being, bathed in light just like him. But as the figure drew closer, Kyle quickly realized that the person was not simply standing in front of the light. Instead, it was made of light, with no distinguishing features whatsoever. Stepping back from the approaching entity, he lost his balance and fell, all the while trying to shield his eyes from the blinding glow. The figure, now just a few meters away, kept approaching, raising a glowing hand as Kyle lay there, terrified and defenseless. Instinctively, the trucker cried out in fear, begging for it to leave him alone. To his shock, the being immediately stopped just a few feet away, pointing at him as if making some unknown accusation. After several moments of silence, the glowing figure turned and walked back into the bush. As Kyle watched in horrified amazement, the shape passed directly into a large tree, the blinding red glow disappearing with it. Kyle did not waste this opportunity. He jumped to his feet and immediately fled back to his waiting vehicle. Stumbling back into the cab, he started the engine and resumed his journey northward, unsure of what it was he had encountered. Whatever the case, he was glad to have gotten away, unharmed. The three stories we have explored in this episode are so vastly different — extraterrestrial twins, a faceless monster, and a figure made of light — that it's difficult to find any common thread connecting them, aside from their occurrence along isolated stretches of road in the Australian outback. These strange tales, along with ancient Aboriginal legends, raise questions as to how such entities could exist in such a harsh environment. Some theorize the Outback is a place where the fabric of space and time is thin, allowing beings from other dimensions to appear. Others suggest it's the site of government experiments, or that ley lines associated with paranormal activity crisscross the region. Is the Outback a nexus of high strangeness, or does its desolation simply fuel wild imaginations? With little supporting evidence, it's difficult to say for certain, but the diversity of bizarre encounters here is unmatched. Unlike other regions known for specific phenomena, like Bigfoot in the Pacific Northwest or UFOs in South America, the Outback has it all, each story more fantastic than the last, yet none fitting neatly into any particular category. Despite being occupied for tens of thousands of years, Australia has only been connected to the rest of the world for 2 centuries. As the Outback becomes increasingly inhospitable, further migration into its interior seems unlikely. Until this vast region is thoroughly investigated, the stories from this part of the world will remain as ominous and foreboding as the land itself.